This is 20 Minutes of Impact from the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish, covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast, my guest is James Dobchuk, President and Chief Commercial Officer for Global Laser Enrichment, or GLE, which is focused on commercializing its laser-based uranium enrichment process. James is going to describe GLE's just announced breakthrough in producing low enriched uranium, which can provide supplies that will be urgently needed for the coming nuclear energy industry scale up. James began his career with over 2 decades in managerial and executive positions for multinational uranium exploration, mining, refining, and nuclear fuel manufacturing powerhouse Cameco Corporation. In June 2021, became President and Chief Commercial Officer of Global Laser Enrichment, which is jointly owned by Cameco and Silex. So, James, what is low enriched uranium, which is what you're trying to produce? How is it used today? And where does today's supply come from?
Yeah, great questions, and thanks for having me on. So, yeah, I'll break that down in three parts, if you will. So, today's nuclear power plants run on low enriched uranium, which we commonly refer to in the industry, and your customer or your audience might be familiar with the term LEU, and that refers to uranium that's enriched up to 5% of uranium-235. So the U-235 isotope is what's needed for the fission reactions in today's light water current fleet, we'll call it, power plants. In nature, unfortunately or fortunately, U-235 only makes up a very small percentage of naturally occurring uranium. It's actually less than 1%, about 0.7%. So there are several steps that are needed to get uranium out of the ore, out of a deposit, and into a form that's actually usable as fuel for fleets of reactors that here in the U.S. and around the world. So we refer to those steps as the nuclear fuel cycle. Again, probably familiar terminology to you and your audience, but it's really a 4-step process. So, we at first, and you mentioned Cameco would go out, find a uranium deposit, mine the uranium out of the ground. And then that uranium, which is often referred to as yellow cake or U3O8, again, terms you might be familiar with, that U3O8 is chemically converted into uranium hexafluoride gas. So that conversion step happens, and then that's when GLE would get involved. So that natural UF6, we call it in the business, is enriched. There's various processes that enrich the content of the U-235 from 0.7 up to 5%. Once that step is completed, that material, it's in gaseous form, is moved on to fabricators. And the fabricators take the enriched gas and through a chemical process make powder. The powder is pelletized as ceramic pellets. Those pellets are loaded into the fuel rods that then are delivered to the nuclear power stations and inserted into the cores of the plants. So in terms of how you get to usable fuel, those are the first 2 steps. Now, I think you also asked, where does the supply come from? So domestically here in the US, we don't produce enough LEU to supply our fleet of 90 plus light water reactors. So there's a plant in New Mexico that produces about 35% of our annual requirements. The rest of the LEU we use here to keep the lights on is imported from Europe, Russia, or a little bit from China and other places. So the Russian component is what makes a lot of headlines these days, because about 20% of our imports of LEU come from Russia. So the business is dominated by big players. They're all SOEs. They're all government, and that's where we see a bit of an opportunity as GLE. if we're importing all of this LEU, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I want to, that's a really important point. SOEs, I think that's state-owned entities. So that if you've got a state-owned entity in Russia
That's right.
that's supplying our uranium, and it's a bit of a concern these days. Our relationship with Russia being what it is, and I just want to. This is probably a good point to stop and say that we're not talking about weapons. We're talking about electricity generation. I think that's an important distinction to make in this conversation, especially because a lot of these terms that you've been using may be most familiar to a lot of people from the early 2000s when we were engaged with Iraq and concerned about Iraq's use of uranium for weapons, and more recently with Iran and Iran's use of uranium for weapons. That's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about generation, but it is a concern, as you say, that significant amount of the supply comes from state-owned entities in Russia, right?
No, absolutely. And that's actually, the nomenclature, the LEU stands for low enriched uranium, and that caps out at 5%. And so that's what you need. That's the commercial market that we're after, and that's the enrichment level that drives the nuclear power stations around the world, the light water ones. Anyway, yep.
Okay. But you were going to talk a little bit more about where the supply comes from today and what could be done about that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So I think what I was trying to do there, just paint a bit of a picture that we're certainly not self-reliant when it comes to LEU. And frankly, the whole front end of the fuel cycle domestically needs to be rebuilt in many ways. But what I was going to say, Herman, is that that's really the opportunity that GLE sees, in the here and now, is that, as we look ahead, we would like to be a domestic choice for US utilities and help them, pivot away from supply from Russia, for example, but also give them a diversity of supply that they haven't had domestically for many years. So that was the point I was going to finish on there.
Yeah, and that's also because the need for low enriched uranium is growing, right? Can you explain why that is? I mean, that has to do, I think, with the nuclear renaissance and so forth. Am I right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, there's a couple of factors. Yeah, why don't I share my views at least on sort of the bright future that's ahead for nuclear. And again, I'm sure your audience is aware of the explosive demand on the horizon with the growth of AI and data centers and the need for all these hyperscalers to build out the plants that they're looking to build in that sort of in that tech space. And so when you think about increased energy demand, those facilities in particular, they need baseload power. They need reliable, large plants to supply their needs. They can't be coming off and on. That's not the way those facilities are run. So the electricity demand projections, if you think of all of the above solution set, well, there's certainly a role for nuclear. In fact, there's probably a really big role for nuclear given its steady state 24/7 operations. And I think when you layer on top of that, some of the things that this administration, President Trump, is trying to do through executive orders. This spring, for example, I mean, he signed executive orders, suggesting we needed to quadruple nuclear power generation here in this country by 2050. So obviously, if you've got that kind of expansion when it comes to nuclear reactor build out, you need fuel for all those plants. And so yeah, there's a lot of tailwinds. And then maybe just before I wrap on that thought and see if you had any other questions for me, there is an interesting demand driver for LEU domestically, which is a result of actions by Congress, right? Like Congress passed a piece of legislation that essentially bans Russian imports starting in 2028. So you've got utility customers here in the US that need domestic supply. And that, again, is a terrific opportunity for us. And then in Europe, you've got some of our like-minded allies who are turning away from Russian supply as well. So there's just the 30,000-foot broad expansion of nuclear that we see on the horizon. And then more near term, we see this sort of geopolitically influenced pivot away from Russian supply, which opens doors for companies like GLE.
Interesting. Yeah, that growth in electricity demand has really changed everything. In fact, one of the pioneers, I guess you could say, of the clean energy transition, Al Gore, just yesterday was quoted as saying that nuclear is appearing to be a growth industry right now, a new growth industry. It was considered too expensive, but the market has just changed with all this new demand. And now it's not anymore considered necessarily too expensive. And we've got a lot of talk about new technologies. As I understand it, low enriched uranium is also going to be needed for all these new technologies. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But I want to, before we move to that last question, I want to move to this one, James, if we will. What is special about GLE's laser-based enrichment process? There's a series of other kinds of processes. Maybe you could kind of summarize them. But GLE is trying to make this laser-based enrichment process work. Actually, it has made this, I should say, this laser-based enrichment process work. What is that, and why are you focused on that? Does it reduce costs or allow more volume? What's going on there? But maybe you should start with just a summary of the basic processes, if you would.
Sure. No, those are great questions. I'll try and unpack it best I can, and feel free to steer me in a different direction if I'm not getting there for you, Herman. But yeah, our process is considered third generation when it comes to sort of the evolution of commercial enrichment. The first generation used a process called gaseous diffusion. And that was a process that was pioneered here in the United States. This goes back to the 1950s, Cold War kind of stuff. We built giant plants. It was incredibly energy intensive, and really it was like using mufflers and filters and filaments and forcing natural UF6 gas through these mufflers, if you will, and filtering out the U-235 and the U-238 isotopes. I often explain it to friends of mine. It's like having 1,000 people in a room, right? And they're all the same height. They all look the same, but some people weigh 100 or 238 pounds, and some people weigh 235 pounds. And there's only like 7 of those 235-pound folks, and you got to separate them somehow. So one way to do it is cut a couple of holes in the end of a gymnasium and push everybody towards those holes in the wall, and the hole's only big enough for the U-235 to get through. You know what I'm saying? It's not very elegant, but it's one way to get the 235 pounders out the door. So that was kind of gaseous diffusion, just brute force separating high energy, very high energy intensive, separating the U-235 from the U-238. So that was a fit for purpose technology. We needed to be there. It was the Cold War. We don't have to get into all that, but you can appreciate why we would use such an inefficient process. It was a means to an end at the time. And then by, I guess it was the early 2000s, that technology had sort of ceded to what is the state of the art today, which is the second generation technology of centrifuge. And the centrifuges are it's an incredibly elegant way to separate U-235 from U-238. It just exploits the mass differential. You put UF6 gas into a cylinder, you spin it at many tens of thousands RPMs, weight different, the physics of it all takes over. The heavier isotopes go one way, the lighter ones go another way. So back to my gymnasium analogy, it's like taking that big gymnasium with 1,000 people and cutting it into really small rooms with maybe 10 people in each, and only one of them, weighs 235 pounds and everybody else 238. And then you spin the room really fast and you open the door every once in a while and you hope the 235-pound guy falls out, that type of thing. So it's really elegant, but you need many, many, many centrifuges. So these cascades are thousands of centrifuges. That said, very efficient. It is the technology that dominates globally today. In fact, all commercial enrichment is centrifuge based. There's a couple of different designs, but it's all centrifuge based, and it's been very, very successful. So our process is obviously different. And
laser based. You use lasers to do the enrichment. That's an interesting idea. How do you do that?
Yeah. So what we've done is our lasers are very finely tuned to a certain frequency and a certain power level that is able to excite or tickle the U-235 isotopes, and largely is ignored by the U-238 isotope. So when you figure out the music that U-235 likes to dance to, and you can configure it, back to our gymnasium example, you turn the music on, the 235 pounders all start dancing, and they conga line out the door that you open for them. So it's a really efficient process. But you know what's key to it too, Herman, is that we can move the throughput of our system is a lot greater than centrifuges. Centrifuges move very, very small volumes of material through these thousands and thousands of machines, if you will. Our process, we can move a lot more gas through our process, and more quickly than centrifuge. So there's an efficiency aspect to our technology. There's a throughput aspect, and because it's efficient and we have higher throughput, we need less of our machines, if I can call it that. We need less of those than the centrifuge folks. So we do have cost advantages from a CapEx perspective.
If you want to hear the big last exchange of this terrific conversation, support the podcast by subscribing at just $2.99 per month to the Power Sector Podcast's Power More. With your subscription, you'll get both parts of the content delivered directly to you the second they drop.